All right, we're going to get started. We're about 5 minutes late, but we'll catch up on time. We're going to finish on time. We're going to talk today. By the way, I'm Alan Day, General Manager, Brazos Valley Groundwater Conservation District. I'm going to try to keep things on schedule. We're going to talk about groundwater data and technology, and we all know that it's extremely important to all the groundwater districts, the data we have, how we're going to use it, how we're going to keep it housed, how we're going to get it protected. So we're going to go into each one of those categories today. Any of our speakers today, I'll point you towards the bios that are in the handout that you got from when you signed in and registered. We're going to start off this afternoon first with Sam Hermitte. She is currently the Assistant Deputy Executive Administrator for Water Science and Conservation at the Texas Water Development Board, and she is over and is going to talk to us about the Texas Water Data Initiative. Sam, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Get this a little lower. I hope everybody stays awake after lunch. I know everybody's in the post-eating food coma, but I'll try to keep things interesting. So I'm Sam Hermitte with the Texas Water Development Board, and I'm going to talk broadly about water data, not specifically to groundwater. I think that the other folks will speak a little more to that. But I want to talk sort of holistically about water data because it really resonates across sectors, whether you're groundwater, surface water. It's really important, and I think that has been highlighted by some of our earlier speakers. For example, yesterday, the gentleman who presented on managed economical recovery, MERS, is what he titled it. He mentioned that policy without science is guesswork, and you can easily substitute data for science in that situation. Data is what we build our decisions on. Also, the gentleman from Denmark, he talked about how there they have well data for all of their wells. But what really mattered, he had a visual, was the column next to the well data, and that was where the well data were combined with other data and information to actually improve decision making. So it was those linking things together that really mattered. No dice on my clicker here. Okay, so let's think a little bit about where we are right now in terms of data. And it's kind of useful to look at the transportation sector versus the water sector. So transportation sector, I want to know how to get from my house to work. Boop, plug it in, get a number of different routes. I want to figure out where to eat near my house. Boop, plug it in, get a whole bunch of different options. So in the transportation sector, we have a lot of data that are geospatially linked on single platforms that provides you access to real-time information. In the water sector, we're not necessarily there yet. I tried to look up some information about water for the Austin area because that's where I live, and I can get good information from the Austin Water Utility on my water quality, but it's in the form of a static report. I can go to my agency's website and look at water data for Texas and reservoir information, and it's tied to my area, but again, and some of it is geospatially located, but these things aren't linked. These things aren't together. You can also get surface water data from TCEQ, and it's geospatial, but it's point data, and it can't be overlaid with my utilities data. So there are lots of pieces of the data puzzle out there in the water world that aren't interconnected. And USGS also is a great source. So challenges that we face are that our data aren't viewed geospatially. A lot of times, sometimes they are. You have to know where to look. For example, when I want to go find Ethiopian food near my house, it just pops up. But if I need to go find information on managed aquifer recharge, I can't necessarily find it unless I already know where to look, unless I'm a groundwater person and have a sense of how to find it. So now, why does that matter? Well, it matters because all of our water policy decisions are based on data. That's the fundamental component of how we make our choices. And there are a lot of key questions that we can't easily answer right now without a lot of digging and a lot of legwork. We can answer pieces of these questions or parts of these questions in isolation. So how much water is there? Well, we have groundwater availability models. We can answer those questions at certain scales. What is my water's quality? There's TCQ data, USGS data, but those things aren't necessarily linked. And then how water is being used. So these are fundamental questions that we still have challenges being able to answer in the water sector. And so why is that? Well, that happens because our water data are really fragmented. This image is sort of the parable, I don't know if you're familiar with it, of the blind man and the elephant. That if you had brought a group of folks together that were blind and had them all touching an elephant in different parts, and you asked them to describe an elephant, you'd get very different answers. And what water data is, you get very different answers to that question depending on which sector you work in, and whether you're working in observational data, what kinds of models you're looking at, whether or not you're using satellite data. So the shape and form can be very, very different. And all of these different components, for the most part, are maintained fairly separately. They're in silos. So what if we start to think about data instead of these disparate pieces as infrastructure in and of itself? I mean, we live in a world in which, we all have our phones. Lots of people, you have it out, you're checking information all the time. We are connected and using data all day, every day. And I would argue that that forms part of our infrastructure landscape in the same way that bridges are part of the landscape and our roads, our electrical grid. The reality is that now we live in a world in which data is also part of our infrastructure. And the transportation sector was really that putting all of the information together about federal roads, state roads, local roads, all of that information being combined with the publicly available GPS data that really changed the transportation data infrastructure world. Was taking those two different data sets and putting them together and not necessarily knowing what the outcome of those combinations would be. I think when Google Maps was starting and these things were coming together, folks didn't know, okay, well, down the road there's probably going to be somebody who's going to develop an app so that you can find playgrounds when you go on vacation. Because nobody thought of it as a need, but now because of these different data pieces being brought together, we're seeing the private sector come out with new tools and new ways to add value to those pieces of data. So, what if we did that in the water sector? What if we started to link our data together in similar ways? And I think one thing that's important also to note about the transportation sector is not all the data is great data. So you can be cruising along, for folks who aren't familiar with Waze, it sort of tells you which is the optimal way to get where you want to go. You can put in information about whether there's a car accident. And sometimes you're going down the road and you get there and there's no accident. The data that you had was wrong, but the preponderance of data is really helpful and actually contributes to better decision making. So in this space, you're getting real-time, essentially citizen science data that's impacting decision making. It's not perfect data, but it's data that's really serving a purpose. So, and then, you can make decisions from that data. You can improve decisions about where to make traffic adjustments based on accident data. There are lots of things that have come about as a result of the combination of multiple sets of data in a similar platform that we wouldn't have conceived of. So thinking about that now in the water world, what kinds of possibilities exist? I know that we can think of some ways in which putting various pieces of the data puzzle together would be beneficial. We can't think of all of them right now because you don't really know until you start to put the pieces together and see what comes out of it. A lot of folks talk about how much time they spend just finding data, looking for, putting together missing values, QA and QCing data, the amount of legwork that it takes to the point that you can actually start to do analysis. Imagine if that time were significantly reduced because you didn't have to invest so much in just finding the data and information itself. So a couple of years ago, some folks got together at the national level to talk about that, to talk about some of this background, why are we where we are when it comes to water data, and where do we want to be? What should that look like? And there was a report produced. It was out of the Aspen Institute. I'd be glad to connect anyone to it that's interested. But there were 3 key findings that came out of that report, broadly speaking, with the state of water data across the country. One of those points was that water is undervalued. I think there's pretty universal agreement on that point, but that water data is even more undervalued. We pay a little bit for water, we pay nothing for water data, almost in every case. And I think that means that we don't place the same level of attention on it. Second key finding was that decisions are being made without data or with very limited data, so just get the data out there. And then the third was sort of an idea of how to go about doing that. And the thought was to essentially build an internet of water. And I'll touch a little more on each of these. First, the finding that water is undervalued and water data are even more undervalued. When we think about all the things that we do with data, that it's the uniform platform for decision making. A lot of folks in the room are familiar with the state water planning process and are engaged with it. That starts with data. That starts with groundwater availability. That starts with surface water availability. That starts with a uniform set of procedures to provide information that then form the basis for decision making. It also improves decision making as data accuracy improves. It can improve precision. It creates space for innovation, like some of those examples I gave from the transportation sector. And it also is what we use to educate the public. Do you know where your water comes from? Do you know how many gallons per capita per day your household is using? That's all data and data driven. And so I like this equation at the bottom where the value of data is really, it's the data times the quality of that data raised to the power of its sharing, that's really where you really get to see the value of the data that we have. So next key finding was that decisions are being made without or with limited data, so just get the data out there. These water droplets, essentially the size of the drop represents the quantity of data at each of these scales, and then the level of coloring in the drop represents how open that data is or how easily accessible to draw it into your own platform if you need to use it. So at the federal level, data is pretty open. There's a 2013 Open Data Act that requires that, and so they're moving toward more openness. State, we're working on it. Local, where there's a lot of information, not as open, not as easy to find, and a lot of times for good reasons. You don't necessarily have the support or the expertise needed to make your data available. But this is sort of what the shape of the landscape looks like. And then so you have to make some considerations. Okay, well, how do we change how much of that data is available? How do we start to make some transitions? And one of the questions you have to ask is, well, do we set standards? Do we broadly set, some universal standards? And if so, what do they look like? And the thought on that matter was that we need to just get the data out there because decisions are being made regardless. But the data needs to be of known quality, because if a person knows the quality, they can determine whether or not it's a good fit for purpose. If you look, I've got a little comparison between USGS and somebody not USGS, and Daniel's going to talk in a little bit. USGS has highly precise, highly accurate QA, QC data. They have really great standards, and it means that anytime you go to their work, you know what you're getting, and that's fantastic. But if everybody had to meet USGS standards, we would have very limited additional data coming forward. But if we just know what the quality of the data are, then we can put more out there, but just be aware of its limitations. Because the idea is that we don't want to create barriers to sharing data. We want to create incentives for people to put their information out there. So as I was just mentioning, in the world where you're getting data out there, there's sort of two components. One is that data producers need to share their metadata. They need to add a description of where the data came from, whether it's been QA'd or QC'd, what its background is, and then the data user makes the decision of whether or not that's an appropriate fit for their purpose. And so looking at those two different things, then the thought was, well, how do we do this? Well, let's talk about developing an Internet of Water. And an Internet of Water essentially being that you have a lot of different data producers that are all have their data and information out there, and that then we start to connect those data sources through hubs or nodes, and that facilitates work by the data user. Somebody doesn't have to know where each piece of the puzzle is. They can go to hubs or they can go to nodes and then be connected. And that doesn't mean that those hubs would take and house other people's data. The idea is that it would continue to be a federated system of data, so everybody continues to maintain and operate their own piece of the puzzle, but that we would work toward connecting those pieces of the puzzle and then drawing together hubs so that over time we would develop more interconnected platforms, bringing together multiple layers and sources of data to improve efficiency and decision making. So what about Texas? That's all well and good, but what are we doing here? Well, in Texas, there are a number of different water data initiatives that came about as a result of this process. So there was sort of this national conversation where folks came up with this idea of the Internet of Water, and at the same time there was conversation in Texas about what can we do to show the value of water data and how improved water data can lead to improved decision making. And there are a few different cases that, or initiatives that were moved forward. One was with the San Antonio water system, and there, in that case, SAWS, they have lots of household level data. They're a utility. They know impervious cover, they know lot size, they know the number of folks per household, and they know that down to the household level. Well, they had never, because it's a large entity, a large utility, they hadn't linked those data with their water use data and their conservation data. And so they worked together with the Pecan Street Project to link these different pieces of their own data, and now they can do household level targeted conservation work. So they can identify, like, for this particular demographic or this group, this type of conservation measure tends to be most effective. So instead of blanketing a neighborhood with one particular rebate that they might have at the time, they can actually identify much more carefully what works the most effectively. And so that saves them money because their outreach is more targeted, and it's more likely to save water, and it's more likely to save the end user money because they're being connected to strategies that are more likely to work for them. So that's one example. The second example is an Environmental Flows Toolkit, or EFIT, which is being facilitated by the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, the Nature Conservancy, and the Texas Conservation Science. And in this case, Parks and Wildlife, with its cooperators, they're looking to pull together information to put it into a decision support tool that is easy to use, that is publicly available, and that facilitates decision-making on how to prioritize restoration. So it's taking different pieces of data and that is geospatially located. Different pieces of data, putting those together to improve decision-making so that if someone comes along and says, hey, I'm looking to try to improve water quality along the Guadalupe River, then they can say, well, if you have the money or the time to work on that, these are the targeted areas, that you can look at. And somebody can go in there, and depending on their priorities, if it's water quality, if it's riparian habitat, they can put in what their priority is and identify the area that's best to use that particular, to target their efforts. So those are two. And then the third, which a lot of you folks are probably aware of, is that TAGD did a series of technical workshops last fall where they talked with folks about GCD data and the possibility of, what do folks want in the world of GCD data? Do you want to try to connect it across your various entities? Is there a platform for putting it out there? What's the interest? What are the barriers? And so that was a series of conversations that Sarah had at the tagged meetings that y'all put together last fall. And then there's one more effort, and that's in terms of Texas water initiatives, and that's the one that my agency has been involved with, which is the Connecting Texas Water Data piece of things. So we held a workshop back in April to look at whether or not is this idea of a hub, an Internet of Water, and Texas having a hub and nodes and trying to further connect our data, is that something that the Texas water community is interested in? And if so, what does that look like? So we had a workshop back in April, had folks from across the state, across sectors, and there were a few key takeaways from that workshop. And the first was that there was very strong support for a Texas water data hub. There was consensus around the need for it and the feeling that, yes, putting our data together can help us answer some of these critical questions. Like there's a lot of discussion about groundwater, surface water interaction. If we can put together more pieces of the puzzle, we can learn more and further the conversation. The second piece, key takeaway, was that data need to be fair. And so this was the acronym findable, because sometimes there are data out there that are really, really difficult to actually find. Essentially, discoverability is another way to think of it. Accessible, meaning that it's machine readable, eventually via web services, but initially that it's accessible, that it has metadata and is machine readable, that it's interoperable so that our platforms, our languages essentially can talk to one another, and that then it's reusable. And then the third takeaway was that this needs to be an ongoing conversation. If we're going to develop a Texas Water Data Hub or nodes, if there's a groundwater node and a flood node, and then they're otherwise connected, that process of what a structure for Texas would look like needs to be a broad conversation involving stakeholders throughout. And if you're interested in having that conversation at this point, the best folks to talk to would be either myself or Robert Mace, who I know everybody in the room probably knows. So the two of us are right now having that conversation also with folks at the Mitchell Foundation, and are looking at how to further this Texas water data initiative here within Texas at a broad level. Taking it down to the scale of my agency, which is the Texas Water Development Board, we have something that we're trying to move forward this next legislative session. And so for those who aren't familiar with state government and the structure, the legislature meets every other year, and agencies have to propose a budget. It's called a legislative appropriations request. And in that budget, you have to propose reductions, but you can also propose what are called exceptional items. And that's asking for additional funding beyond your current level of funding to undertake a specific initiative or effort. And so our agency has asked for a few different exceptional items, but the top priority exceptional item is a flood technical package. And for those folks who have been here, and either you listen to Senator Perry or you listen to Representative Larson, you know that flood is going to be a big issue and a big item on the radar this coming session. And our agency has been doing some flood work in the past, and we're looking to expand what we do. And part of what we're looking to do is to develop a flood dashboard, which you could think of sort of as a node, like I was describing, and along with that, a data hub. And so the flood dashboard, one thing that we learned through Harvey was that the emergency response community, those folks often have to go to a dozen different websites to be able to make decisions. So they're looking at transportation websites, they're looking at forecasts, they're looking at stream gauges. There are literally a dozen different websites, and they can't put them together in the same platform to make decisions. So you're looking at a dozen different little screens trying to see where this overlays with that, and it impedes decision making. So the flood dashboard would essentially be a use case to demonstrate in Texas how, if we combine these currently disparate data sets, it can improve the efficiency and the quality of decision making in an emergency response event. So that's what we're looking to do with the flood dashboard, but connected to that, we want to start to develop a water data hub for Texas that would help you initially just be able to find where the information is. Because another thing that the Hurricane Harvey and the flooding brought to light is that we don't know all of the ways that events might be connected until they occur. After Harvey, it was probably, about a week after, we started getting calls at our agency about groundwater well water quality testing, because there was concern because there was so much water and it sat for so long that it would be infiltrating and starting to contaminate folks' wells. And the Texas Floodplain Managers Association are right over there. And usually groundwater well quality is not something that is part of their day-to-day work. But it was, and then folks didn't know where to go because we don't have a central location. The flood folks know where to go to get flood information. Y'all know where to go to get groundwater information, but we don't have somewhere that we can send anyone who is interested to go and find the information that they need. Similar with Representative Larson was talking about aquifer storage and recovery. It hadn't largely been discussed in the context of flood flows. Representative Larson has talked about it, but it was not a part of the broader general conversation. And so for somebody who's outside of the ASR or the managed aquifer recovery or recharge world, where do they go to learn about it? Well, it's hard to know. It's hard to find out. You just have to sit there and either call your friend who happens to know somebody in the groundwater world or spend a lot of time on Google. But if you had a Texas Water Data Hub, and one of the things that you could look at was ASR or MAR, you would be able to find that information more quickly. So the belief is that we don't know all the ways that different water pieces of the puzzle are interconnected and that there's benefit in facilitating access to that information. And just to round out, this was a quote from one of our board members at that water event in April that I mentioned, and I think it really captures the idea behind all of this, which is that the better the data, the better the science, and the better the science, the better the policy. And I think that's the connection that we want to make. So that's all I have for today. I'd be glad to answer any questions. I know we were a little behind getting started. And if anybody has any questions, would like to, get either of the reports, I'd be glad to share those later.
Anybody with any questions? Don't be afraid. All right. Well, thank you, Sam. Thank you so much. Let's give her a round of applause.